To know margin and to know capital is to know your business, and understanding how these two work together can take the value of your business 20 times greater than what it potentially is at the moment. Hi, I'm Brendan Mills. Welcome to today's video on margin and capital. We look at the 4 quadrants of business. Low margin, high capital, which is the worst. Then low margin, low capital being the second worst. Then high margin, high capital being the second best. And high margin, low capital being the best of the 4. By the end of today's video, you're going to understand where you sit in that quadrant, and most importantly, the steps to take to get your business up that ladder and in the most powerful quadrant of high margin, low capital. When we're referring to margin, we're referring to the gap between what you sell your product for, whether that's tangible or intangible, and the cost associated with producing that product. That's your gross profit. The calculation for gross profit is revenue minus all your direct costs gives you your gross profit. And margin as a percentage is the gross profit dollar value divided by the revenue figure. For example, if I have a product that I sell for $100 and the inputs cost 70, my gross profit is 30. To take that one step further, gross profit percentage, which is the margin we're going to be looking at, is the $30 gross profit we create divided by the $100 revenue. Therefore, the gross profit percentage is 30%. When I'm referring to low margin, in my opinion, low margin is a business where you have a gross profit of 30% and below. Now, there are some exceptions to that, like the construction industry. Construction is renowned for having lower margins, but also they're selling larger products at a larger revenue base that then covers their associated costs. I'm thinking businesses that fall outside that construction realm. In my opinion, 30% gross profit is low margin. When we're referring to capital, that is how much money does my business require, regardless of how rich or how poor the owners are, to sustain and run this business. And the core elements of capital are the following. Firstly, your fixed assets, your plant and equipment, your machinery, your vehicles that might have to go into creating and delivering the product that you are selling. For example, if you're running a trucking business, it's the trucks. If you're running a hire business, H-I-R-E business, it's the assets that you're renting to people. If you're running a manufacturing business, it's the machines that create the product that you are selling. If you're running a service-based business where the only assets you need are laptops and desktop computers, they are examples of fixed assets as well. Other examples of capital are referred to as working capital. These are elements that are involved in the day-to-day cycle of your business. Firstly, there are your debtors or accounts receivable. These are the funds that you are owed by your clients who you've sold to on credit. Then there are things like stock, which is the physical stock, either raw materials or finished goods that are sitting on your shelf. And there's also work in progress, which are elements that aren't raw materials but aren't yet finished products. They are a work in progress and not yet finished. Your debtors, your stock, and your work in progress are a drain on the capital of your business. So the more you have of those items, the higher the value of the capital you require. The offsetting amount of that is your creditors or your accounts payable. These are the businesses you deal with that allow you to buy from them on credit. So you can offset a portion of your outlays that you have with your debtors, stock, and work in progress with money that you owe to other people and to other businesses. The combination of those figures is the capital of your business. When looking at the capital structure, it isn't necessarily a dollar value, it's the dollar value relative to how much gross profit is being produced. Further to that, you also have things like debtors. If you've got a client who is not paying quickly, if you've got to wait 90 days, that's an example of high capital. If you've got creditors who need you to pay them in advance, not give you terms, that's an example of high capital. If you've got to carry a lot of stock of something because you're importing it, again, high capital. If you're carrying too much work in progress, high capital. These are, as I said, subjective terms, but I want you to be able to point to this in your financial reporting or investment analysis to see this. To give you a sense of how important this dynamic is if you're running a low margin, high capital business, you might get a multiple of 3 or 4 for your business, which means the profitability of the business times by 3 or 4 is roughly what you might be able to sell the business for. But if you've got a high margin, low capital business, you look at what the shares on the share market are valued at for businesses like that, it is in the stratosphere of multiples. Now, I'm going to assume that you're not living in that space. I'm going to assume you're a SME business, a small medium enterprise, somewhere between $0 and $500 million in revenue. In that case, you're probably going to be getting a multiple of 20 plus if you're looking at selling your business. So rather than multiplying your profit 2 or 3 times, you can multiply your profit 20 plus times, and that will get you the sales price if someone was to buy your business or invest into your business. Do you want to know the worst business I ever dealt with? It wasn't to do with the people. It wasn't to do with the way they worked. It's where they sat in relation to their capital requirements and their margins. The worst place to be in a business is to be a low margin, high capital business. This business was selling very low margin products with very, very high capital requirements. To put some specifics on this, they had equipment that was in the millions of dollars. It was worth about $1.5 million, very high tech, but they were producing around about $60,000 worth of revenue a month from that piece of machinery, and the margin on those products was about 10%. So they would sell $60,000 worth of product, and the physical inputs that went in to create that $60,000 was around about $54,000 worth of inputs. If you're creating $6,000 worth of margin a month on machinery that's worth about $1.5 million, that is a horrific place to live financially. It's not even covering the loan repayments for the piece of machinery, let alone the other costs associated with running that business or that department of that business. To be clear, it wasn't the sole revenue source of that business. Obviously, they would be dead before you know it, but they had this high degree of capital invested in this area that was creating exceptionally low margin. What did we do with this business, and what should you do if you find yourself in this area? The first is, how do you remedy the high capital? The fastest way to diminish high capital is increase revenue. Now, we've got to be conscious when we do this, but if you've got a machine that has $1.5 million cost and you're producing $60,000 worth of revenue from it, you have to find a way to get more revenue through that machine, literally, not just figuratively. Literally, you have to get more revenue through that machine, because remember, your capital percentage is a reflection of how much revenue you're producing. So number one, how can we get more output from what you've already invested? The other side of the equation, and this is more challenging, is how can I create more margin? What do I need to do? Am I selling a commodity product? If I'm selling plastic water bottles that are just being spat out off a conveyor belt that has no branding and no positioning, then I'm probably going to be able to sell those bottles for 20 cents, 25 cents. But if I build a brand, think of something like a Frank Green, all of a sudden that water bottle has far more value to it. I could be using the exact same piece of machinery, producing the exact same volume, but all of a sudden I've got a higher margin being created. If you can't see a path where you can accelerate revenue without killing your cash flow and as a result killing your business, or you can't find a way to use that capital to create a differentiated product that you can create a higher sell price, which then creates a higher margin, or you can't find a way to produce it more efficiently, which reduces your cost, which then increases your margin again, because remember the two drivers of margin, a higher revenue, lower cost, is to divest. With this business that I referred to, they put a lot of emotional and physical energy into making this investment work. And it wasn't an easy decision to come to, but they exhausted their avenues of more revenue, trying to speed up the output of the machine, trying to look at ways to reduce the cost to produce the product, and they couldn't find a way to sell their product at a higher price. They weren't able to differentiate enough to make it work. So we came to the difficult decision of selling that piece of equipment. And when I say difficult, it was difficult for them because they put a lot of effort and energy into making that work. What does this mean for you as a business owner, an investor, or somebody wanting to get ahead in their career and their decision-making process? Before you get a thesis from anybody around an investment, understand what is the margin that this investment is going to create and what is the capital cost associated with it. Break down how much is your physical outlay for machinery or other forms of technology? What is the associated costs of producing that product? Who are the end consumers? How long are they going to take to pay you? And do you have suppliers that are overseas that might demand deposits or payment in full before you even receive the goods, as opposed to someone locally who might give you 30 or 45-day terms to pay for their product? The chance of succeeding in business when you are this type of business is you really need to rely on volume. You need to have a heck of a lot of volume going through your business. An example, a business we worked with many moons ago, I was in my early days, I wasn't even 25. They were a nationally renowned trucking company. You can imagine how much investment goes into a trucking company. Mack trucks, the trailers that go onto the back of the trucks to ship everything around, and the labor cost associated with that. They made a total margin of less than 20% and had a very high capital base, but they were able to create enough revenue to make it work. The other way to survive through this process is find a way to increase the margin on the product you're selling from the investments you've made. They're the only two ways, and if you gave me one option, it would definitely be to create the higher margin. But that is challenging. That is not easy. You'll have to redefine your process, and you also potentially have to redefine how you're positioned in the market. Why do people pay double the price for an iPhone in comparison to any other mobile phone on the market? It's because they've differentiated. They don't necessarily have a doubly better product than everything else out there in the market. If you live in this space as a business or as an investor, you have to seriously think about whether this is something you should continue with or how can you accelerate your way out of this. The next type of business is a low capital, low margin business. What is the risk associated with this? Well, it's most likely opportunity cost. You're not getting the most out of what you have. Now, an example of a low capital business is something like a service-based business or a business that has very little capital requirements to make it succeed. Also, what might fall into low capital, low margin business is a construction business. Now, that might seem counterintuitive because you go, construction, there's a whole bunch of capital that goes into building a property. But capital is relative to how much cash you're getting in. Isn't a house or a commercial construction an example of a massive amount of capital? Well, in terms of outlay, it is, but it might not be in terms of capital, because if you're using other people's money to fund the project, that actually isn't a huge capital drain for your business. There's nothing wrong with that until things go wrong. And that is where the risk is of running a low capital, low margin business. Let's look at the real negative first, and that of the risk associated with it. If you're running a low capital, low margin business, the risk here is that if one thing goes wrong, the house of cards could fall down. And we don't mean house of cards in terms of you're doing things fraudulently, but imagine if you're a construction company working on 10% margin and 2 or 3 projects go over time, over cost, over budget. It might take you 10 more projects just to catch up on what you had lost. Now, that is not an easy equation to have. So you've got high risk associated with that, and you don't necessarily have the capital, e.g. plant and machinery, to then sell on the back of a few losses, you don't have the capital backing you up. So that is very, very risky, and that is quite often why you see construction businesses failing. Too low a margin, not enough capital invested into the business. Are you challenging yourself on the price that you're selling your product at? Whether that's a big commercial construction project, or you're trying to sell your photography services to a husband and wife to be for their wedding day. Are you underselling the service you're providing or the product you're delivering? How can you build that out? How can you make that potentially more elaborate in their eyes and have higher differentiation, but not actually fundamentally change the way that you're delivering the product? I always tell people that is like flexing a muscle. Do I rock up to a meeting with somebody and feel great about, hey, we're increasing our prices or we're going to charge more? Yes, you feel a little bit awkward about it, even if they don't know that you're asking for more from them than the 3 or 4 other people you've just done projects for. But it's flexing that muscle. It's one of the most crucial muscles you'll develop being a business owner and a business leader. And what you'll realize is, gosh, I can charge a lot more. I am delivering value that allows me to charge for that. The key element though is ensuring that the person receiving what you're doing sees the value in the cost they're investing. The panacea here is very similar to the low margin, high capital business. Can you find a way to differentiate your product so you can create more margin? Are you not charging enough? Are you seeking work where people want to ram you down on price? If you're a developer in the construction space and everyone wants to just push down price and keep pushing it down, is that a field you want to be playing in? Can you differentiate yourself enough to create that margin? Can we reduce the cost of delivering our product to increase the margin? So our sale price might stay the same, but our costs associated might decrease, creating more margin for our business. In this case, it's not a risk of how much we've invested, it's the risk of either opportunity cost, or if something goes wrong, it goes really wrong really quickly. The next layer up is we've got high capital and we've got high margin. This is a place where we go, awesome, we are selling a product at a margin that we are satisfied with. I said earlier, 30% is what we define as low margin. I would say 40% and above is when you start to get to very good to elite margin. Again, depending on what industry you're in, but as a general rule, 40% gross profit and above is a benchmark we strive for. And the 30 to 40% margin is sort of a no man's land. How can we push and get to that 40% space? When we're talking about high margin, high capital, I'm assuming that you're at 40% and above in your gross profit. Your high capital is, as we said, in the low margin, high capital business. It's most likely to do with either how quickly you need to pay your suppliers, how much stock you need to carry, how long people take to pay you, and how much investments you have in physical machinery and assets to create the margin, to create the product that you're delivering and selling to your clients. The panacea here is quite obvious. It is ramp up the revenue. Because to ramp up the revenue on your capital base, particularly your fixed assets, is to ensure if you're getting the high margin, you need to increase the volume of what you're doing things. One of the best ways to reduce the capital in your business is to increase the revenue. So keep the capital base the same, but increase the velocity, i.e. the revenue in your business, while still maintaining that margin. Now, where this falls over is if you seek out revenue which is not at the same margin, that can be and will be an incredibly risky path to take. But if you're doing that by maintaining the margin and accelerating the revenue, that is a great place to be. An example of where we've done this is a business that took their process and they were manufacturing out of a very sophisticated hub within Australia where they were manufacturing their product, and they stopped selling just in the state they were. They sold nationally, and then they sold internationally. So all of a sudden, they had enough margin in their product where they didn't just sell it to the person down the street, they sold it to the person in the other state, and they even put it on a ship and sold it to somebody else in another country. When you have high margin, you have a far greater opportunity. Jeff Bezos is famous for saying, your margin is my opportunity. Now he means it in terms of if you've got a high margin product, I can come in there and find a way to deliver it for lower price, lower cost, and still make a win, essentially try to destroy your business. In this case, we're referring to a business where you've already got high margin and the incremental cost to deliver it to somebody, i.e. the freight to get it in their possession, does not destroy your margin. And even in some cases, you might be able to charge that freight. But even if you can't, it gets captured in such a way that your margin is still excellent. You're increasing your revenue base and suddenly your capital structure does not look as high relative to how much revenue you're producing. Now, as your business grows, you need to be aware that yes, your debtors are naturally going to increase. Yes, your stock's going to increase, your work in progress, and your creditors are also going to increase, especially if there's prepayments. But I'm also thinking of the assets that are deriving that revenue for your business as well. Expand that revenue base, go into different markets, go into bigger markets, and all of a sudden, that capital base does not look so high. I want to set a challenge for you. If you're a business that is high margin, high capital, but you feel like you can't increase your revenue base, please respond to this video, email me. I will personally respond to you and do a strategy session with you to help break through that. I strongly believe if you've got margin, the game is yours to win. And how can we reduce that capital risk is by increasing that revenue base. Add the strings to the bow. Look at who's buying, where are they based, what are they buying? How can we add more while still maintaining the integrity of that margin in our business? The last one, high margin, low capital. Now, one thing that I have not mentioned until this point in time is the value of your business. We're talking about profitability, we're talking about margin, and we're also looking at your balance sheet. But those two things combined can bring you a valuation on your business. And who would have thought, if you look at the layers we're going through, a low margin, high capital business, business of least value. Low margin, low capital, second least valuable business. High capital, high margin, second most valuable business, which then takes you to the big daddy, the high margin, low capital business. That is the most valuable business. Why on earth do you think software companies are worth squillions of dollars? Because once you've created the product, i.e. what's been researched, what's been developed, what's been created, you don't need to outlay stock. They don't exist. When you sell software, it's generally credit card, automatic subscriptions, automatic payment. There's no risk of somebody not paying you. And there's the creditors, there's no suppliers, there's no supplier of the software. You've created the software yourself. There's no work in progress. Yes, you have people who are developing the software, but that as a relative cost is inconsequential, and hence why you have margins in the 80-90% realm in software-based businesses. Now, are you pausing the video, or about to pause the video, go, well, I don't sell software, so I can't get into that space? No, I'm going to tell you about that in a moment. Before we jump in, I want to share with you what, in my opinion, is the greatest business decision of the last 10 years. And that's by the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella. I think I'm probably butchering his name. I always read his name, but I never actually hear his name said out loud. He's the gentleman that took your Office 365 or whatever Microsoft Office was to you from being a CD that you purchased and plugged in, and you had that subscription until your laptop or your desktop died, i.e. you made a one-off purchase of that amount. And if you were able to keep your laptop going for 3 years, you didn't have to pay for Windows again or for Office. He took that to a subscription-based model where you're paying $10, $12, $13 a month. The value of Microsoft as a result has absolutely skyrocketed from already a place that was phenomenal. In my opinion, that was the greatest business decision made in the last 10 years. Why am I using that? It's a subscription-based model. You don't have any debtors. There's no stock. You've got the software and you're building that recurring revenue organically within your business. Can we look at ourselves and do that in our businesses? Unless you're somebody working on software at the moment, and absolute credit to you, you're probably not in that space. So how do we create a high margin, low capital business? Well, it's through differentiation. It's how do we differentiate what we do. So we've created the high margin between what we sell the product for and what it costs us to produce the product. And I know businesses, as we said in the last type of business, 40% GP and above is what I define as high margin. Low capital, the best driver of that is to increase your revenue base. What are you doing to expand the revenue of your business? How do we get to that place? If you're ever looking at selling your business or getting people to buy into your business or investing into your business, the best value is going to come from when you have a high margin, low capital business, because you're producing a product that gets a lot of value from the revenue it sells and keeps a lot of value of it, but it doesn't take a significant amount of cash, relatively speaking, to create that revenue. And you think at the bottom end of that, of high capital, low margin, is it takes an exceptionally high amount of revenue to create any form of meaningful margin based on a very high capital base. You're asking for cash from people more and more and more to produce a relatively small return as a result. We want to ask for people for less and less cash to still create that same high margin result. Where do you see yourself in that spectrum? Of the margin of the capital, where's your business sit? Even if you're an employee without an aspiration to necessarily run a business, that is completely fine. But how would you understand your business model at the moment? Where do you want to take your business that you're running? Or if you've got a vision in your mind, how much capital do you need or how little capital do you need? Do you need to potentially flex that muscle around what pricing you structure your first lot of services at to not be a low capital, low margin, but a low capital, high margin? Let us know what you think. Shoot us an email, contact us on this page. We would love to help you through your journey to get from low margin to high margin, high capital to low capital, and to maximize the return for you as a business and for you as an individual in your personal growth journey.